Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
And from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/I Hear of Sherlock. I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 259, Sketches of Scions.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Walder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hello there, and welcome once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Walder.
And Burt, you're looking a little sketchy tonight.
Well, that's my signature look. In fact, it's not just any signature look, it's my key signature look.
Ah, I see what you did there. I see what you did. Usually you're off key, but tonight
that's true.
You are positively harmonious.
Ooh, excellent.
We're going to have a great discussion today with Josh Harvey, who is a musician by training and a Sherlockian by association. He's got a wonderful story to tell us. And where the two interests intersect, I think, is what will be most fascinating for the audience here. And of course, if you like the Granada Sherlock Holmes, the Jeremy Brett series, then you'll want to stay tuned for this, because Josh has some really interesting background stories for us about interacting with the composer from that series. Something you don't want to miss. So buckle up and get ready for that. In the meanwhile, wanted to remind you that you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/ihose259, all lowercase, ihose.co/ihose259 will bring you right to the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere website. You know, you can sign up there for email updates so you don't miss when we have non-podcast posts. We do post things other than audio files there. We have commentary. We have a fortnightly series from our pal Steve Mason, Rusty Mason, and Joe Fay called Baker Street Elementary. It's kind of like Peanuts for you Charlie Brown fans. Peanuts for Sherlock Holmes. And we have guest posts and whatnot. So book reviews, I mean, you name it. We have all kinds of offerings there on the website. So feel free to look us up there at ihearofsherlock.com, where you find the show notes, and subscribe to us there. And of course, as we mentioned in the intro, we do look forward to your support on Patreon. We have thank you gifts at a variety of levels, and of course, we do regular bonus material for our Patreon listeners, and we offer the shows ad-free for our Patreon supporters as well. Another great bonus of supporting I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere for as little as $1 a month. Check it out and see what works for you. Josh Harvey began his professional accompanying career in church music at the age of 15. and he quickly began playing for musical theater productions from high school onwards. He received his degree in music theory and composition from Washington and Lee University in 2000 and became a lecturer, accompanist, and musical director for his alma mater's Department of Theater and Dance and Department of Music. He received his MA in the musical direction of musical theater from the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland in 2012. He's currently an instructor, music director, accompanist, and voice teacher at the Dobbins Conservatory of Theater and Dance at Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. He's played all over the world in churches, theaters, rock, jazz, choral, gospel, symphonic, and performance art settings for weddings, funerals, bar mitzvahs, and concerts, including events in London, Germany, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Canada, Cuba, Costa Rica, Norway, Haiti, St. Croix, and Finland. Josh is presented at various Sherlockian events like 221 BCon, Scintillation of Scions, and the DePaul Pop Culture Conference of 2022. Josh Harvey, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thanks for having me.
So, with all of this organ playing in your background, I have to ask you, I mean, this is, even before we get to the Sherlockian stuff, are you currently an organ donor?
I actually am. If I were to be in that situation, at least that's what my driver's license says.
That's great. You know, back when I was at Boston University, the chairman of the board of trustees was a little guy who looked like the Monopoly Man, literally looked like the Monopoly Man. And he lived in this huge mansion out west of the city, and he actually had an organ in his house. And you know, he eventually moved off to greener pastures or, well, some kind of pasture, and dismantled his house and gave the organ to Boston University, who then installed it in the student union for, you know, receptions and big things like that. And I joke that he was probably the largest organ donor that the university had ever known.
That's actually very interesting. When I was growing up, my dad is a Southern Baptist minister, and he was serving at a church in Virginia, and they wanted to get rid of their gigantic pipe organ, and they put an advertisement in, you know, some sort of church music magazine, and, you know, nothing happened with it. No one called or anything for months, and then randomly the secretary picked up the phone, and this booming voice on the other end, which would you would do a better impersonation, Scott, than me, because I'm clearly a tenor and not a bass. But he said, "This is Mr. Shea. I would like to talk about your organ." And it was the great bass baritone singer for the Billy Graham Crusade, George Beverly Shea, and he wanted to get the organ, and so my dad struck a deal with him because they just needed someone to clear it out, and it was going to cost more money, you know, to have it taken out than, you know, even just to trash it, essentially. And so he struck a deal with Mr. Shea that he would come and do a concert at the church in exchange for this, you know, gigantic pipe organ, which then he moved into his home in North Carolina. And I mean, he has since passed, but I'm sure it's still there. Additionally, he had a pool that was shaped like a piano, and you walked down the steps, which were partially the keys of the piano. So I guess being an organ donor in both directions could be lucrative.
There you go. I love that story. Well, you know, as much as I would love to find the connection between organs and literature, and really the only one coming to mind off the top of my head is Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I know he had a pipe organ installed in the Nautilus. However, we want to talk about Sherlock Holmes. So, Josh, tell us, please, how you first got to know Sherlock Holmes.
I think, like many people approaching 50 rather than 40, my first encounter with Sherlock Holmes was the Granada series on, you know, in real time on PBS Mystery. And I have very clear memories of standing on a chair watching that on a really tiny black and white TV in my parents' home. And it must have stuck fairly early. I mean, that would have been 85, I guess, when I was 7, so somewhere around there. And about the same time, I've recently discovered in the past year or so a picture of myself from approximately that age when I had ventured from Virginia with my grandparents to visit my aunt and uncle in the San Francisco, LA area, and in California. And there's an extant picture of me somewhere wearing a deerstalker. So that must have been all around the same time. And the earliest introduction to the canon, and I think this is important because, I feel like Sherlockiana is sort of constructed, through the academic lens of hierarchy, which is partially influenced by the Catholic lens of hierarchy historically. And so, Sherlockians always seem to have great sort of hagiographies of the great saints of Sherlockiana. And as a Catholic, I like to think about the All Saints, all those other people that we don't hear about. And I had a babysitter at that time who was a remarkable woman named Dot Fuller, and she died close to her 90s in about 2021, and she had a son who was remarkable of his own accord, whose name was Jim, and Jim developed muscular dystrophy as a child, and was giving all sorts of terrible prognoses. And I actually was able to reconnect with him a couple of years ago and return his copy of the complete canon, which she had lent me. He actually lived to be 65, lived a very long life. But she had seen my interest and said, "Oh, my son Jim is off to work, living someplace else. I think he was living in Washington, D.C. Would you like to borrow this, complete edition of the entire canon?" And so I'm assuming that I had that until probably 2015, 2016. So for 30 years, I had that single copy, and I was able to return it to him sometime around then. So it's sort of something I've always been aware of. It's something I've always enjoyed. That's something actually that my wife and I bonded over. We actually had a club for her university, which I guess could have been a little mini Scion, the Sherlock Holmes Club of Buena Vista, Virginia, not Buena Vista because that would be not Southern, but Buena Vista, Virginia. And we used to just go and we watched all the Jeremy Bretts. We delved occasionally into the A&E Nero Wolfe series, which I also have always really liked. And I found pictures recently of Christmas parties. I know that we would hand out Barnes and Noble copies of the full canon as door prizes. Of course, BBC Sherlock and the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock. So I've slowly kept up with rereads of the canon, not as extensively, but I sort of feel like I've been immersed in the renaissance of the post Robert Downey Jr. and BBC Sherlock that has taken place for lots of people. And so I've just always sort of had Sherlock as part of my life, and just COVID actually let me explore a little deeper into the world of Sherlockian meetings. We were members of the Sherlock Holmes Society of Scotland when we lived there, and so I was able to work on that, and then work on a bunch of the stuff regarding Patrick Gowers that I had sort of started back when I was living there. And so now I'm sort of casing the joint a bit, creeping around meetings over Zoom and conferences and things like that, and really having a good time connecting with other Sherlockians.
Yeah. So, all of that is just fascinating, and there's a lot to explore there. So, but I want to back up a little bit and talk about we just talked about your beginnings with Sherlock Holmes, but let's now talk about your beginnings with music, either as a listener, consumer of music versus an actual musician yourself. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I've I guess many elementary school, middle schoolers, started out playing the tuba, which is very humorous for people that meet me because I'm barely 5'6", and you know, marching in Christmas parades and such. My dad actually had to carry that sousaphone around for me, and when it was time to play, I would put it on and play, and then take it back off, and then he would put it back on. So that was my first, and then I got into the piano. I would say relatively late for someone who is, I guess, a professional piano player at this point. It was about the sixth grade, and growing up in a small rural town in Virginia, and my parents said, would you like to play the piano? And there wasn't any valid reason not to. And so I took to that, and I guess just by a trick of the brain, I was able to read music very quickly. And so that has sort of been my career, and that's what sort of kept me into musical theater, because you're basically a professional sight reader in musical theater, and that's what I do all day long, every day, is basically sight read for musical theater classes, for students singing, working in class, that sort of thing. And so I moved into church music at the age of 15, which also really, gave me a little bit of actual pocket money as a 15-year-old, and gave me a place to play, and learn music quickly, and have to, keep a bunch of different songs in my brain for the next couple of Sundays at a time, and then I would occasionally play preludes, or postludes, or offertory sorts of meditation music, and that's something I still do. I'm basically going to hit 30 years this fall, I believe, of playing in churches and doing church music. So it's sort of just a continually rolling group of musics that I'm responsible for in all the facets of my life. And having those sorts of skills, I've been really fortunate to work for various choirs, universities, which allows me to encounter lots of other cultures. I've lived in other countries. You heard in my bio, I've played in a lot of different places, at a lot of different countries. So I've therefore consumed a lot of different musical material culturally, and then in high school, in college, I was sort of in jazz bands and things like that. Started playing in small cafes with small jazz groups and things like that. So it's a pretty wide experience. I'm sort of a jack of all trades, master of none. But then I have to remind people that it's better to be that than only a master of one.
Well, but you're being very self-deprecating there, because I note you mentioned earlier about being in Scotland, and I know from your bio that you have a master's in the musical direction of musical theater from the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Tell me what was that experience like, and how of all the places in the world to be, you wound up being in Scotland?
Well, I think I think there's a time in every boy's life at the age of 33 when they're unmarried and just kind of still hanging out, being a bachelor, doing different gigs. Um, I just think at some point I decided that I probably needed to get a piece of paper in order to sort of do. I'd met my wife. I mean, essentially, my wife and I got married, and 10 days later, moved to Scotland. And when I was looking for grad school, actually, what had happened was I was reading a textbook for the education of musical theater students, and it was trying to find the information of the two men that were the authors. And for whatever reason, in the Google search, up popped this program for the musical direction of musical theater. And at the time was basically the only program. Now there are other programs now, undergrad and post-undergrad programs that have a similar degree path. But at the time, it was sort of a really new educational track, and that was the only place in the world that had a master's degree. I had been to Scotland. I did study abroad in London in the sophomore year of college, and I never made it to Scotland during that trip. But I'd spent a summer with my family. My dad did a pulpit exchange. You know, preacher family got to move to this little tiny place in the middle of nowhere in Virginia, essentially. But during that trip, we were able to go to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and do a little exploration of Edinburgh. And so I had a little bit of familiarity with Scotland as a country, and as well of I was familiar with the music of a man named John Bell, who was a big church musician, and has written some pretty famous hymns that people sing in church in all denominations at this point. And I had met him, oh man, even maybe 8 or 10 years prior to moving to Scotland at a conference, and had just chatted with him over lunch or whatever, and had gotten his information. And when the time came, I had just written him and said, we met at this place. Would you have any insight into where to live? And he said, yes, you can come live with me in my flat. And so my wife and I moved into the flat of John Bell, the composer of the Iona Comedy. And my piano teacher has a pretty strong relationship with the Iona community, visiting the island of Iona in the Hebrides, which is, sort of a ecumenical pilgrimage center for the world. So I had several sort of connections to that part of the world. And so, and of course, who wouldn't want to move to Scotland to go to grad school? I'd even prior to that served as a university chaperone for a theater department that took a show to the Fringe. So I felt like it was I still feel like it's another home. I haven't been back since we graduated, or since I graduated from that program. But yeah, it's a wonderful experience. It's a lot of work. It's 12-hour days, 6-7 days a week, putting on musicals. But it's a really cool thing to say that my master's thesis was conducting Stephen Sondheim's company at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival every day for that entire month of July to August, 2012. So not many people get to say something like that. So it was a lot of fun projects. I had really great classmates who have all done pretty remarkable things. And yeah, so I mean, Glasgow is a great city for the arts too. So it was a cool place to be.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. So what's your thinking about the musicals of Sherlock Holmes, about Baker Street and the various musicals that folks have put on over the years with I think it's safe to say limited success.
Yes, and I don't want to take away from this conversation. I had a very similar conversation with Madeline and Dixie of the Dynamics of a Podcast. I think I have a theory, and the theory is it's sort of the same reason that superhero musicals don't work, and it's essentially because I feel like in a musical, if you're watching a Marvel movie and you're waiting for Bruce Banner to Hulk out, it's usually due to some sort of emotional stress or emotional outpouring. And that sort of takes the place of the power. And when a musical, a character in a musical sings, it's sort of in the same place. And I consider Sherlock Holmes to be a sort of prototype superhero of an intellectual sort. And so I think I haven't seen a musical that I think works as well as others. I mean, the only superhero musicals that have ever really worked for me are Matilda, and I think it works because she's a child, and there's something appealing to audiences about that, and it's a sort of pseudo positive revenge plot as well with children, and that's always gratifying to audiences. And then the Toxic Avenger, because it's basically a parody of itself, and it knows that musicals about superheroes don't ever really work. And also, I'm not sure if anyone has cracked the code if Sherlock Holmes needs to be a Henry Higgins sort of character and not really sing and just sort of sing, but it just never, I know, clearly we know he's a musical person, but even in the canon, it feels like the point where maybe, Conan Doyle estate lawsuits about his emotions aside, that when he needs to vent himself, that he plays the violin. So I have an idea for a musical regarding the Sherlock Holmes universe, but I don't think you could really see Sherlock Holmes until kind of the last, maybe the Deus Ex Machina moment, or sort of like you see him in The Great Mouse Detective. Just shadows, he would be the fiddler, but I guess not the fiddler on the roof, but the fiddler in 221B sitting room. But I'm not sure he can be a character for it to. I don't know. That's just my feeling about why, because I know people there's gonna be even more of them coming out. We all know that with the copyright being up. So I just don't. I think that's why they don't generally work for me.
Well, I think that's a fascinating analysis, Josh. I mean, music is fundamentally emotional. It touches us not only through our ears, but through our hearts. And Sherlock Holmes, being a very logical individual, separated from emotion, it would make logical sense that he wouldn't necessarily be as closely tied to music, at least as an expressive type of pursuit. And yet, I think in many, if not all, of the major Sherlock Holmes productions on television and film, music is a very important element, soundtracks and scores and whatnot. And you mentioned previously there about Patrick Gowers, who, of course, was the composer behind the Granada series. And he sent along a handful of photos that we have for our Patreon supporters. We're going to post those photos in our Patreon entry so folks can see you. You were actually in the Gowers flat in 2012. Talk to us a little bit about that. How did that come about?
I don't want to say sure dumb luck, but almost sure dumb luck. I have always been a fan of that score. Prior to moving to Scotland, I had at some point rediscovered, the CD, I think. It's only recently just come back to streaming. I think it just came back to Spotify in the past 6 to 8 months. In fact, I wasn't even aware that it was on Spotify until someone had told me. When I was in Scotland, you kind of have to do these sorts of day internships or internships sort of shadowing people on the West End. The goal to try to get you into London and to do some of just observational work. And I just really took a chance in writing his son, who I thought he was the easiest person to find, was his son, who is Sir Timothy Gowers. He's knighted for his work in mathematics. And I found his academic email address and said, I'm very interested in meeting your father. And, I have a little bit of time and money from my school to have a quote unquote internship. It has to be music related, doesn't have theater related. Sounds right, is the same similar sort of overlap. And he very graciously wrote me back and said, here's my mom's email address, and worked this out. And so in February of 2012, I took the train down and met Caroline Gowers, Patrick's wife, and she took me. He had a severe stroke in the early 2000s, which actually damaged a significant part of the hemisphere that allows creativity. So as he got older, post-stroke, he was able to do higher and higher levels of, calculus, experimental math, but he was physically, from a neuroscientific perspective, unable to create, to compose. but he could still listen to his own music and talk about it, and analyze it and have discussions about it. Anything that was pre-existent, he could analyze. That would be math, but to come up with it from scratch, really rough the capability. And so I was able to meet with him and talk to him for a short period of time. And he's in assisted living. He was pretty much homebound, bedbound. And after that, I talked to Carolyn, and I was like, I'd really like to help out with some work, maybe just try to get some filing, some archiving. And she took me to her flat and opened up a closet, and not only was the Granada series there, but other work like the soundtrack for Alec Guinness in the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy TV series Smiley's
sure.
People.
Yeah.
He had written that soundtrack as well, and I said this bigger project. Then I'm a student. I'm going to be kicked out of the country by the end of this year, but I would love to list them. And so once my program was done in June, I went down there, and then my wife joined me. She needed to graduate from the program that she was in about a week later, and we lived in their flat. We stayed up in the attic room, and we literally just started pulling scores out. A lot of the material, like the old orchestra parts, things like that, had already been removed, but all the basic stuff, the big full orchestra scores, were all still extant, and they were just sort of in a hodgepodge. And we spent a couple of days. I mean, we also had a good time in London for the couple of weeks that we were there. But basically, we would sort of work in the morning and then go out in the afternoon. And we were basically just pulling all these sheets of paper and making sure we could find, putting them in order. I mean, literally just kind of taking the sound cues, finding them by episodes, putting them back into sort of episode order, making sure the pages were in order. And then we took them to a place in Western London, out I think around Zone 6, which happened, and everyone was confident about that. We were a little bit nervous about getting these, taking these things outside of the flat, because that was it. I mean, those handwritten copies were the only thing that were, that still, was left at that time. And so we found, again, this is 2012. It's not, you can't just put all these things into a copy machine like you can now and scan them. We had to take them to a bulk scanning place, and we're talking, I think, I don't remember now, but it was close to 1,500 to 2,000 pages of orchestra scores, because there's obviously, you all know, there's a lot of music in those Granada series, and these were the full orchestra conductor scores, and there's only about five measures per page on some of them, and so there's a lot of stuff. And once we found out that the bulk scanning place was also responsible for the archiving of the music for the BBC orchestra, then everyone felt way more at home, comfortable with taking these documents out. And I remember them out basically in a big suitcase strapped to like a rolling dolly because it was so heavy. And we took a took a cab out because obviously I didn't want to drag all that out on the tube. And within a couple of days, they handed us a CD-ROM and said, "Here it all is." And so now at least it's preserved digitally, and it's not really freely available. It's unclear to me exactly how much I can make available, and when and how. And so I just sort of have been holding on to it for almost a decade until COVID, at which time I was more able to be at home. And essentially I went through every Granada episode with the scores. I found places where things were missing, like things had disappeared. There were a couple of tracks that I knew he had taken and given as gifts. He'd taken sound cue ever and as a gift. And so then I spent a little bit of my own, Sherlockian time finding a woman example who had one of the only handwritten piano versions of a couple of things that he did as an arrangement as a gift to her. She originally lived in Japan, and when he went to Japan with his wife, who was a Suzuki piano method teacher, he had basically handed her as a young person, as a child or a teenager, this handwritten version of a sound cue. She's the only person in the world that had it, and after a bunch of research on the internet for a couple of weeks, I was able to track her down over Facebook in London, and she was able to send me scans of something like that. But I basically just went show by show, cue by cue, and was just sort of looking at how he uses that opening melody, that sort of iconic opening melody, in different ways throughout the entire soundtrack, which is, you know, the next stage for me will be doing that all over again, because once wasn't enough, and how many times there's never enough Granada viewing, and I just got to figure out what to do with all this information. But I got through all of those episodes over the pandemic, and just sort of have this big bulk of information just sitting in my computer.
Wow. Well, that's fascinating. You know, as a major Granada fan myself, and as someone who dabbles in music, certainly appreciates music, and I've listened to the Gowers soundtrack. I can't even count how many times. Used to have it on cassette tape. Now I've got it on CD, and it's on Spotify again. By the way, on Spotify with some horrible spelling mistakes in some of the tracks, which is amusing. So go look that up, folks, and check that out. But my goodness, I mean, what a treasure trove, Josh. And this idea of, kind of a major theme and creating variations on that theme, I think Gowers did a phenomenal job adapting the theme to the various settings. You know, a very English pastoral kind of version in the Musgrave Ritual, for example. A kind of an American / slightly Irish lilting theme with Elsie Cubitt and the Patrick family from The Dancing Men. The absolute bonkers version of it in The Devil's Foot, which you, of course, hear as part of our theme song here. It's just fascinating to see how he reworked that main theme for each successive episode or story.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating too, I mean, people are becoming more more interested in Gowers, I think a little bit since he passed several years ago, but also, due to programs like yours, due to our friends Gus and Luke at the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes podcast. There's a lot of people are sort of rediscovering him, but also there's always been this sort of hidden fandom of his that once I started getting into this, I've got friends that conduct soundtracks and write soundtracks for Netflix. They're all Gowers fans. I've got another Facebook friend who I met through a conversation that kind of can part of a subject, and he works for the Kurt Weill estate, working on orchestrations and managing the orchestrations for the Kurt Weill estate. And he was giddy. He said, "I've always wanted to see the orchestration of this one moment in the opening of The Hound of the Baskervilles." But I'll send it to you. And I just sent it to him, and it was like, he's like, I've been waiting my whole life to see how he did this, how he voiced the chords, and now I have a little bit of access. I mean, the other really fascinating thing about the soundtrack, which I actually do have some photocopies of the handwritten, what he called the Sherlock Holmes suite, which is licensable, that orchestras can license and perform, which is mostly the soundtrack, but some other things that if the soundtrack album had maybe been a little bit longer, maybe if it had been on streaming instead of LP, that he would have included.
What kinds of cues are those?
I'm trying to remember. There's just some of the extra, they're just extra cues from the show. I haven't looked at the suite specifically, but it's basically the soundtrack in order, plus a couple of some of the what I think you're recognizing, Scott. Some of those super iconic places where maybe the opening of the show was a little bit different, or extra instruments are being used, and he rewrote the soundtrack. He rewrote the sound cues. For example, that Elsie Cubitt cue that you were mentioning, which I agree 100% with your musicological analysis. It's a sort of almost a pastiche of the Dvorak Symphony for the New World, like the Largo. It got some Irish lilt to it, and most definitely having Elsie Cubitt's American background being represented. What is played on the soundtrack that we stream does not exist in the show. It's basically just that opening theme repeated, and then it stops. And he took compositional care to expand that for the soundtrack, to expand it for bigger orchestra than the one they were using for recording the soundtrack. And part of the great fun of the soundtrack is that he purposely hid, we think, some of those motivic additions into every single track on the soundtrack, so that the listener could go on their own Sherlockian journey of trying to find the opening motive in every single track. And I think I have found all of them, but I know that he specifically rewrote it in that Elsie Cubitt track. He added the opening theme. It's hidden, and I know that because he tested me on it when I first met him, and I failed the test.
Well, it's certainly a mystery for our listeners to explore. We're going to take a quick break here, and then we're going to come back and explore more with Josh Harvey and his sketches of Scions. Stay with us.
What was Conan Doyle really like? Thanks to American journalists, now we know. And you can know too when you get your copy of Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the Newspapers, Volume 6, just published in January. Volume 6 covers the first month of Conan Doyle's tour of the United States in October 1894. Just 4 weeks, but it produced 230 pages of articles, interviews, reports from his lectures, and much more. And because of American interviewers, it's the first time we get really close to Conan Doyle the man. They tell us what he looks like, his way of moving and talking, and all those little things that form a three-dimensional image of the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Get your copy of Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the Newspapers, Volume 6, edited and annotated by Matthias Bostrom and Mark Alberstadt at wessexpress.com today.
Okay, well, we just talked about Patrick Gowers and Granada. I mean, we could probably do an entire episode just on Gowers and sampling some of that. But I, Josh, am much more interested in sampling your own music. Because you've gone on a journey here, and we have a number of playlists of your complete and growing set of what you call sketches of Scions. Tell us a little bit about the origins of this project, how it came about, and we're gonna cue up some music for folks to listen to here in a bit.
Well, it sort of happened by accident. I think as any person is trying to fit into any group like Sherlockiana, for example, you're trying to find your place, and there's obviously such a very strong tradition of music amongst Sherlockians. Currently we have Karen Wilson and Alex Catt, Jim Ballinger, Karen Gold, but Harvey Boot, and going back in the history, people like Harvey Officer. I think you're just looking for a place to do what you do. And, I'm an academic. I can write papers. I love doing presentations. It's literally my job when I teach classes. But also, you're trying to find maybe a little bit of a vacuum that hasn't happened before or someone hasn't done before. And when the Legion of Zoom started by Steve Mason and, sort of escalating over the pandemic, once they decided they were going to have their first sitting room, I sort of just came up with an idea in my brain of what that would sound like, what that would be, worked on it, and said, here, conferences have, music before them. Would you be interested in this? And the original trio, the board, listened to it and said, yeah, that's really cool. We'll use that. And I thought, okay, that's cool. That was fun. That was a good project. And then
why don't we give that a listen so people
Sure.
understand what we're talking about? This is a theme from the Legion of Zoom. Well, that was a lot of fun.
Oh,
So-
that is a lot of fun. Josh, take that apart a little bit. I mean, when you listen to great scores and you listen to great film music as an example, there, as you pointed out earlier when you were talking about Sherlock Holmes musicals, there are great emotional moments in these films that, get linked to motifs and get explored and so on and so forth. So when you're putting this together for something like the Legion of Zoom, what was going through your mind? How did those themes add up to how did you get to where you got? I guess that's what I'm asking.
So for me, very often, because I have done a lot of improvisation, sometimes it starts improvisationally. For this, I think it's pretty, I think I had a fairly clear idea that, slightly tongue-in-cheek for the idea of the Legion of Zoom, being a riff on, the DC Comics Legion of Doom, and the idea of Saturday morning cartoons and Saturday morning cartoon soundtracks. That was sort of my first idea of what it was going to be. And, I like to put clues in my music too. And, the very first bells at the top are the exact pitches of when someone enters a Zoom meeting. And so I just sort of used the idea of the pitches at the beginning of the Zoom meeting when people entered, which we have all heard, and I had heard literally teaching all of my classes for almost a year and a half during the pandemic. And then just trying to have fun with the idea of that Saturday morning cartoon. I'm using a digital audio, program, so none of the instruments are real, so you're sort of hindered with the limitations of what you can, the fun and the challenge is what you can make sound real, and what can feel successful in that space of computer guided music, essentially, when you're composing. But I just sort of improvisationally go through things, and then I think, oh, maybe it would be great to have a French horn. French horn always sounds good in a computer sample. We'll put a French horn line. Big Hans Zimmer like trombone blats sound really good on a computer. Certain string things, things that don't sound good on computers are usually upper woodwinds and brass. So compositionally, I'm a little bit limited in that way, but that's part of the fun also. It's to try to find something that sounds cool and it's got the vibe that you want. I generally, for all of these sketches, sort of gave myself the parameters of place, space, and page. And so the place, as we start talking about the other scions, I mean, the actual location, like what city is this in? Place for me is a little bit more like the mood, the vibe, maybe of that locale, or a sense impression that I have of those things. And then, of course, the page, there's canon references, and when the scions are named with canon references, I try to go back and read them and maybe bring something of the story into that little sketch. And they really are, sketches. They're not. So I'm not considering these like full compositions. I really do think of these as, plein air paintings that are taking place quickly. And by quickly, I mean 4 or 5 hours. I mean, to put something together and then mixing it down a little bit usually takes about an hour. And they're not supposed to be, for me, I feel like there should be 12-step meetings for perfectionists. And I've post-perfectionist period of my life where I'm just having a good time. And, occasionally if something doesn't quite sound the way I want it to, or I can't get it quite right, well, I'm just learning the program better. So, in certain ways, some of the later sketches maybe sound a little better than the first ones, but I really like the human element. My Virginia acquaintance is the photographer, Sally Mann, and she very often picks pictures where you can see, a scratch on the side of the lens, or, something in the chemicals that didn't quite go right while the picture was being developed. So she purposely puts, or allows imperfections. And, I'm not doing this for a paid gig. It's not a movie soundtrack or a TV soundtrack, which would be an entirely different situation of trying to keep things, super clean, super mixed well, perfect. These really are sketches.
Well, and I think that idea, that notion of imperfection, that's important because even in the canon itself, we find that Sherlock Holmes was less than perfect. As often as we see his successes, we quite frequently see that he had some failures or he messed up along the way. So it's, I think, injecting this human element that we can all relate to. So let's take you up on some of your enumerations here. You talked about place, space, and page. Let's use place as the jumping off point for this next sketch as we land in our nation's capital for this sketch from the Red Circle of Washington, D.C. Wow. I detected a little bit of When Johnny Comes Marching Home injected in there. Would that be accurate?
I mean, I definitely think that any sort of Washington, D.C. has to have a little bit of colonial slash, John Philip Sousa as a reference to that. I mean, for that, I really was thinking, what would it sound like? And honestly, Patrick Gowers did a good job with this because anytime the mafia is used in the Granada series, he he has he uses the same first three notes. So, like in the Six Napoleons, that theme is related to like the Red Circle. They're not quite the same music, but they're in the same key, and they open with the first same three notes. So I would definitely trying to think a little bit of, what would if there's a mafia John Philip Sousa overlay hybrid. So it's kind of a Sousa-esque marching band with a little bit of mandolin in there, like an Italian, mandolin. I mean, early on, one of the things that became very apparent, the first series has the first volume has a certain purity, but I realized really quickly I couldn't just write, if I even made it through all the Scions, I couldn't just write different versions of an opening to a PBS mystery soundtrack. I had to think of other ways to include other styles of music. I mean, for my own sake, as well as listeners, because I think pushing the idea, the Robert Downey Jr. Hans Zimmer soundtrack has pushed the idea of what Holmes should quote unquote sound like a little bit differently, and of course BBC Sherlock has a totally different take, and so several things have come up. Does something sound like Sherlock Holmes enough or not? And I don't know what the answer to that. It's like we all sort of inherently know the answer to that question. Even my kids do when I play. They're long suffering listening to some of these. They might say that doesn't feel like a mystery, and I'm like, but what does that mean? Is it in a minor key? Does it have to have a certain vibe? Does it have to feel foreboding? Does it have to feel like someone's searching for something? But I realized that if I compositionally limited myself to what essentially would be like the opening of any mystery, and there are great ones out there. I love the Magpie Murders that just came out. It's sort of a mystery, the new Netflix series Lockwood and Co. It's got a completely slamming opening. The BBC Sherlock is iconic. Granada's iconic. I don't really feel like that's what these are completely, but I also just was very cautious and aware after the first volume that they were all going to sort of sound the same because it's the same person writing them if I didn't further afield into other genres of music. So the Red Circle, that fits to me, a sort of John Philip Sousa mafia overlay.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting American/Mediterranean, march versus Marcia, as it were, in Italian. So, well, I'll tell you what, let's stay in the Mediterranean. And this, I think, just underlines your point that you were making there about exploring different styles. This is the sketch you wrote for the Greek interpreters of Lansing. And we're going to hear, I think, far more about the Greek accent rather than the Lansing accent, because I don't think many people know much about Lansing, let's face it, but when you do hear Greek music, it becomes very apparent. Well, fortunately over here, the microphone was muted because the smoke detector went off because of my Saganaki I had to fire up. to go with that that theme. Saganaki and Souvlaki. Opa. So that was a lot of fun, and kind of nodding toward what you were mentioning there before, Josh, about what sounds like a mystery, what sounds mysterious, what sounds foreboding. I think you've done a really good job in capturing those elements in this next track, which is for the Sound of the Baskervilles, which is, I think, from a group out in Seattle, from the Puget Sound. This is a sketch for the Sound of the Baskervilles. I really like that one. There's just something foreboding and kind of echoing the depths of the nearby coast. It really has a nice feel to it from my perspective.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, the general concept, and again, trying to get maybe place or space and page together, my general idea was, what is a version of Hound of the Baskervilles? How does that align to, the Puget Sound? And, the easy answer is fog. And so I was definitely trying to think about fog and, the moors and the fog on the Puget Sound. So, on the other hand, what I want to say also, these are just my impressions, right? I mean, I wanted to put a little La Mer, like Debussy's La Mer feeling in there for the ocean. These are not anticipated to be accepted by all the Scions. They're just, quick little homages. Some of them have been adopted semi-officially. The Legion of Zoom, of course. Peter Blau being a person that I've always assumed he was very complimentary about the Red Circle one. Other groups I have had no response, which is 100% okay. I did want to go back just for a second though too about the Greek interpreter, because it's a joint song. It's not only the Lansing Greek interpreters, it's also for Athens, Alabama. It's one of the few Scions names that has been utilized by two different groups of people in two different parts of the United States. And, I was really happy with that one because with the Greek interpreter being, a very clear introduction to Mycroft as the brother, I really was thinking about these sort of two brotherly sibling paired scions in both with the name Greek interpreter, which is why there's sort of the Greek theme at the beginning, and in the middle it sort of goes more into like a bluegrass feeling for Alabama. I'm from Appalachia. I grew up listening to bluegrass and having bluegrass at, going to parties where live bluegrass bands were playing. So I have a huge fondness for bluegrass music. And by sheer dumb luck, as I was going through, I realized that both of those melodies, with a little adjustment, could be played at the same time. So you sort of have this sort of idea of, from the page, the two brothers, and the two brothers, showing off their intellect in the Diogenes Club, but also you have these two brothers of Scions, and that their musics actually fit together at the end, that last sort of refrain in the music, if you will.
That's really interesting. I like that. And thank you for pointing that out. We got one last track that I'd like to play, and I think this is the most recent in your playlist that we have. And this is from Nashville. I guess is it the... I forget the name of their group.
Yes, the Scholars of the Three-Pipe Problem.
That's it. The Scholars of the Three-Pipe Problem of Nashville. You want to set this one up for us?
I think you can hear everything in the title of the Scion. That's my hope, and then we can maybe talk about it after that.
That's great. Here we go. All right. That was a lot of fun. Fill us in on this one, Josh.
Right. So I'm not too far from Nashville. Obviously, that's a sort of country music city homage. I once probably, about 20 years ago, played at the Sundance Film Festival. And the band that played after the band I was playing in was this at the time slightly unknown band called Nickel Creek. And I spent about an hour over the hors d'oeuvres talking with this young, brilliant mandolin player, Chris Thiele, about Bach and Wagner counterpoint. And he's the real deal. And of course, now he's a MacArthur Genius Fellowship winner, took over Garrison Keillor's program before the pandemic killed it, as one of the greatest mandolin players alive. So I was definitely thinking about some of his tunes and how he writes stuff. But also, because I wanted to sort of be self-referential, to itself a little bit, it's a little bit recursive, I actually wrote what would be considered the final third as the tune, and was sitting, and as these have gotten more, self-conscious, I've actually, instead of just improvising parts, I'm like starting to write scores out and, actually compose them for certain ones. And this was one, and I was sitting there staring at the what again now is the final third, going, okay, that's the solution to the problem. How do I represent in music him figuring out over two other pipes, the solution. And so when you hear the match go at the beginning, I basically took the melody, the completed melody, and literally took scissors and tape and copied and cut it up and pasted it all up and put it on the floor and try to make it make musical sense with a couple of iterations here and there, changes for better composition, I guess. And so I'm really proud of that one because knowing that I know that's what I did, I really like. Firstly, I wanted to create a melody that felt like he was figuring out a problem, and then I also figured out a way to represent each of the pipes as he was figuring out the problem. So the first pipe is part of the melody, but it's all sort of jumbled, and the second pipe, it's sort of a little bit more unfolding, a little bit more advanced, and then the third pipe, you sort of get the third pipe, and you get that sort of what feels like a bridge. It's sort of slightly newer material. It feels like it's ascending a little bit, and it's like the aha moment, and then it's like he spills out the full melody at the end. So it was sort of and it was my attempt, because I think like the soundtrack to Elementary, for example, that opening does a really good job of giving us the vibe of Sherlock Holmes trying to figure out a problem. It's a little bit mechanical, right? They've got that sort of Rube Goldberg mousetrap imagery going over. And I wanted to do something similar, but it also had to be bluegrass because it's for Nashville.
Yeah, it really worked. And that explanation, I think, really kind of brings it all home. Well, this is a lot of fun, Josh. And I suppose the closing question here is obvious. Can Science Societies commission you to do a custom number for theirs, or are you just simply going to be dabbling in this to your heart's content for the foreseeable future?
Both, and by commission, I mean just give me some more guidance to what they would be interested in. In fact, Monica Schmidt, we did that process for the younger Stanfords one. We had a good conversation about things that wanted to be highlighted, the brass tradition of the Midwest. The founder of that Scion, if I'm remembering correctly, was a piano player. We wanted to feel like sort of ragtimey old music that could be music hall from the Sherlock Holmes time period, but the American analog, of course, was ragtime. And, they seem very happy with that. So, yes, it's more just, I actually prefer that because I think, having a little bit of input and conversation means I can get to the heart of the Scions, and many of them I've not been able to attend. Either they don't have Zoom meetings or they're too far away. The first volume is essentially the ones that I attend regularly, and I feel like I have a better sense of connection to them as opposed to going blind. So absolutely, if anyone wants to contact me, that'd be a fun project.
That is fantastic. Well, we will put your contact information in the show notes, and we thank you for sharing your musical and Sherlockian journey with us here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's amazing to me to hear the story that Josh told about being so intimately connected with the work of Patrick Gowers and to actually be able to hold in his hand the musical score for so much of that very distinctive music. And it's odd, isn't it, when you think about it, how much attention is paid to the manuscripts of short stories and novels and to the personal memorabilia of writers, but seldom, you only hear about manuscripts and discovered things when someone finds a new fragment of Mozart or something that you can associate with Beethoven. But it's not really as much of course, you've got the notebooks of people like Bob Dylan, and of course, and all the writings of John Lennon. So maybe it's more popular than I thought, but I was just stunned by that.
I think you bring up a good point, because there's almost an assumption these days, particularly with scores, that we have the recordings. We have the output of the work that these people put in. Whereas with Mozart, with Beethoven, and as Tom Lehrer would say, some of that crowd, they didn't have recordings in those days. So the printed matter was really all we had. And there were obviously complete scores, but then, as you say, fragments, lost pieces, unfinished pieces, right? And I think that's where this gets really interesting for Josh to take all of that material. And quite frankly, even some of the things that don't appear in the commercially available soundtrack album, and to be able to find those cues. And I'm just picturing him as he was telling this story, putting all of this stuff inside of a large suitcase and shuttling it across London. It was kind of like a scene out of a heist film, but it was clearly in good hands after they were done with it. And quite frankly, I'm excited to see what may come of it in the future. I think there's nothing but opportunity in front of us. Hey, it's a new year, and that means new content. Lots of new content coming from our friends at MX Publishing. Now, it doesn't have to be a new year to find new content from MX Publishing. In fact, if you sign up for their newsletter, you'll get updated every week about some of the latest. For example, every week, Steve MX sends out THIF. Thank Holmes, it's Friday. And in the most recent one, there's a news about a Kickstarter campaign, Sherlock Holmes and the Unmasking of the Whitechapel Horror. Then there are free audiobooks, including The Keys of Death by Gretchen Altebeff, Sherlock Holmes, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, Volume 1 by David McGregor, and The Bird and the Buddha Before Watson, Book 2 by A.S. Croyle. That and Sherlock Sunday. Every week you'll get an update about new Sherlock Holmes books. All you have to do is go to the wessexpress.com homepage, go all the way down to the bottom, and you'll see a little box there to sign up for the newsletter, where you can get information about promotions, new products, and sales. Make sure you check it out and see exactly all of the great content that's coming from our friends at MX Publishing. All right, everyone loves those dulcet tones because they mean there is opportunity in front of us in the form of a quiz show. That's right, it's everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show, Canonical Couplet, where we give you 2 lines of poetry and we expect you to come up with the correct answer on the other side. Now, the last time we were in these parts, we greeted you with this clue. Watson knew the man who came to Holmes quite agitated. The miscreant may rise to heights once he's been emigrated. Burt,
Yes.
do you know
Yes.
the name of the story that we are looking for here?
Oh, I do. It's a terrific story. It's one of Sherlock Holmes' frequent interactions with secret codes. And this one is the one about the secret code that's tapped out by hopping poultry. It's the case Watson called the dancing hen.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Oh, boy. Oh, almost, but not. No, sorry. We were looking for, in this case, the 3 students.
Oh, Mo, Larry, and Gilchrist.
Gilchrist and Soames, yeah. They made a clean getaway.
What a soap opera that was.
Indeed. Well, not this time around, but I am looking through our responses here, and you know what? I'm beginning to think.
No.
Yeah, I'm looking through the responses here. I'm seeing. I know. I'm trying to see if anybody got this one.
Oh, really? Gee, I thought that was a pretty easy one.
No, these are for the last one.
This means you'll have to send me a book.
You've stumped everyone, Burt.
Yeah. No, that can't be. This was pretty easy.
You would think. No one got it.
Really?
No one sent in the 3 students. I have lots of Greek interpreters.
Really?
That was the previous one. Well, we have one person who said the illustrious client.
Really?
And no, all Greek interpreters since then. You know what? I'm going to go back and check the file to make sure I didn't really muck it up, because something is fishy here. Something's afoot here, and in Quizland. Well, I was going to say we could recast this one, but we already gave away the answer. Let's get on with it and give the clue for this episode. You wouldn't think a preposterous old hellion could fool a clever doctor like Trevelyan. If you know the answer to this episode's canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose your name at random, you'll win. Good luck. And we will have a prize for you out of the iHose vaults. So something fun, I'm sure. We have lots of stuff to choose from. I know our pal Tony Katroki gave us a number of printed matter, and we are working through those number of books and whatnot. So that should be fun.
Yes, very good.
Yeah. And speaking of books, I mean, we do have a number of great authors to speak to in the coming weeks. People from, the world of the BSI Press and the Christmas Annual, and we have folks from the theater in the future to speak with, and folks from other musically inclined folks. So lots of great guests lined up here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And of course, if you have a recommendation for someone who needs more attention, needs our attention, and is a good interview subject, then please just drop us a line at comment@ihearofsherlock.com and let us know. We'd be delighted to hear from you. And Burt, you were recently at the 221 dinner.
Yes.
What's that all about?
I was. Well, every February 21st. It's a emerging annual event that was dreamed up by our friend Ira Matetsky. The idea that when February 21st comes around, 221, it's a great opportunity for a Sherlockian dinner. Well, and as you know, anytime you can rub 2 Sherlockians together is an opportunity for something, for a drink, for a dinner, for a conversation, for a flame. And we had a grand time at a bistro in Manhattan near Washington Square, a great old neighborhood in New York, and had a great time. There were about 12, 15 of us. Great group.
Oh, that's nice. What a lovely new tradition. And of course, 221, that is International Sherlock Holmes Day in the United States. Because as you know, elsewhere it is 21/2. So if you wanted to celebrate 221 Day in another, it would be January 22nd. That would be 221 Day everywhere but the United States. So
but what happens if you have a mirror and you look at your calendar backwards? Couldn't you?
Well, then you start in December.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah,
that
means you won't get to January 22nd or February 21st until, what we normally celebrate as November or December. So there's time to plan.
Yeah, that's one of these techniques that Leonardo da Vinci developed, writing mirror script, writing backwards. But actually, recent scholarship has determined that the real reason he did that was so that he could never be pinned down when it came time to sign the check. People said, "What is this?" Can't make out this name. So he never had to pay. Think of all the gnocchi he ate, that nobody got to.
You save a lot of dough that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is the always forward-looking Scott Monty.
And I'm the completely upside-down Burt Walder.
And together, we say, the game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.